So this video is about how Christianity changed the world in a very simple sense. In a big way, and really it's a long list of all the things that you think are good about the modern world and are wrong with the world before the modern world. You can probably in a big way blame Christianity for that. And because it's so good, there's a danger for us to become sort of imperialistic and think that everyone, needs to become like us or else they're just terrible people. Now, as Christians, we do believe that being a Christian is the right thing to do, but there's a sense in which you take that a little too far and you start trying to force it down people's throat. And so here's an example. Charity is basically Christian in origin. We'll look at that in a minute. And you scroll down the Wikipedia page, and then they're going to have this Hindu concept of charity. When in reality, Hinduism, charity is not such a big thing because karma and reincarnation are fundamentals in Hinduism. And karma is the idea that you will suffer. There's no forgiveness. That's kind of the point of yoga. You stretch and it's supposed to be painful, and then you're paying for your evils that you've done, that you're working out your karma. And so the idea is they had caste system of very clearly defined classes. You're born to a low class, then your life needs to be as bad as possible, so you will work out as much karma as possible. So, charity's not that big of a thing in Hinduism. It's fundamentally a Christian idea. The word charity just comes from the Greek New Testament, caritas, which means grace. So, anyway, which means, basically, it means giving somebody something they didn't work for. The opposite of earning it is grace. So, or charity. So, the danger is, like in the example of India, there was a big British imperialistic idea that everyone who's not British needs to be British, and there's something wrong with you if you're not British, and you better go be British. When in reality, it's really Christianity that brought to the world this idea that imperialism is wrong. Yeah, we believe we're right, but we should feel guilty for trying to force anyone to accept our ways. And what's famous is there's a famous British atheist by the name of Bertrand Russell who said that Gandhi, who, really through pacifist, peaceful resistance brought an end to the caste system in India, he said that Gandhi's method would not have succeeded, his peaceful resistance method would not have succeeded if it did not appeal to the conscience of a Christianized people. Okay. Let's just begin and take a look. Alright, so the first thing we're going to take a look at is the medical world. And in the medical world, here is the Christian Medical Fellowship, but they're quoting a different journal that's not, so I'm not going to just some Christian source. It's going to be super biased. And so it's Triple Helix, Spring 2000, and they've even got, I think his page is 9 to 14. But they give you a quick summary of it. Over 2 millennia, Christian doctors and nurses, inspired by the example and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, have been at the forefront of efforts to alleviate human suffering, cure disease, and advance knowledge and understanding. Christianity is all about loving everyone, even those who don't love you back. That's what Jesus did, right? Look at what it says. Jesus of Nazareth taught, "Whatever you did for the least of one of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Before Christianity emerged, there were several hospital-like centers in Buddhist regions. The ancient Greeks practiced a very simple form of medicine, and Greek temples included places where the sick could sleep and receive help. The Romans are believed to have established some military hospitals. However, it was the Christians of the Roman Empire who began to change society's attitude toward the sick, disabled, and dying by their radically different outlook. The Greco-Roman world in which Christianity appeared was often cruel and inhumane. The weak and sick were despised. Abortion, infanticide, and poisoning were widely practiced. The doctor was often a sorcerer as well as being a healer, and the power to heal equally conferred to the power to kill. Among the pagans in the classical world, only the Hippocratic band of physicians had a different attitude to their fellow human beings. They swore oaths to heal and not to harm, and to carry out their duty to care for the sick. However, it wasn't until Constantine granted the first Edict of Toleration in 8311 that Christians were able to give public expression to their ethical convictions to undertake social reform. From the 4th century to present times, Christians have been especially prominent in the planning, siting, and building of hospitals, as well as fundraising for them. So they didn't invent medicine, they didn't invent doctors, they didn't invent taking care of the wounded and the sick, but they began to change the world's attitude towards it, where this is something that it should always be done. Cities with significant Christian populations had already begun to change prevailing attitudes. So the thing is, before Christianity was made legal, it had already changed the Roman world around it that wasn't Christian to begin to copy Christian ideas. And we're already beginning to build hospices, guest houses for the sick, and chronically disabled. Stories of Christian caring had enormous impact even before Constantine's decree of toleration. Clement, a Christian leader in Rome at the end of the 1st century of the Christian era, someone who very possibly knew Paul, records how the Christian community was already doing much to relieve the plight of poor widows. In the 2nd century, when a plague hit the city of Carthage, pagan households threw sufferers onto the streets. The entire Christian community, personally led by their bishop, responded. They were seen on the streets, offering comfort and taking them into their homes to be cared for. A few decades after Constantine, Julian, who came to power in 355, he was the Roman emperor who reinstituted paganism. And what Julian said, that is, if the old religions of Rome were to succeed, they were going to have to care for people even better than the way that Christians had. Alright, so we could keep going. In 369 was skipped a bit there. But, you know, orphans and widows, they impressed the Roman writers and philosophers. In 369, they founded a bed. Christians of Caesarea founded a bed and cared for plague victims. In the so-called Dark Ages, 476 to 1000, rulers influenced by Christian principles encouraged the building of hospitals, and it was around 1000, I believe, that Christians actually went on sort of a hospital building spree, and they really took off. Charlemagne decreed that about close to 800 AD, decreed that every cathedral should have a school, monastery, and hospital attached. Members of the Benedictine order dedicated themselves to the service of the seriously ill to help them as would Christ. Monastic hospitals were founded on this principle. In the later Middle Ages, cities with large Christian populations, monks began to profess medicine and care for the sick. Monastic infirmaries, this is why the Red Cross in hospitals have crosses as their logos, okay? Alright, local population, even surrounding areas. So in other words, it was priests who always, it was the church guys who always were the doctors. A church ban on monks practicing outside their monasteries gave the impetus for the training of lay physicians. It was contended this interfered with the spiritual duties of monks. In other words, they were doing so much work to take care of the sick that they couldn't do their other jobs. Gradually, cathedral cities began to provide more large public hospitals with the support of city fathers, and this moved medical care into the more secular domain. Nevertheless, expansion of healthcare by the secular authorities continued to be challenged and stimulated by the church's example. Eventually, as there were few major cities and towns without a hospital, and there were particular diseases such as leprosy where the church, inspired by the example of Jesus, made a point to touch and heal these outcasts from society, took a lead, the church built countless leprosy isolation hospitals. Even though the actual medical knowledge was meager when compared to modern standards, the efforts of the Christian church nevertheless brought relief and mitigation to suffering to thousands of sick people. I mean, we could keep going with this. A new age of hospitals began with new institutions built by devout Christians for the sick, poor, supported mainly by voluntary contributions. Alright, I mean, it keeps going. Advance of medical knowledge. As well as taking a leading role in caring for the sick, Christians also played an important part in furtherment of medical knowledge. Together, Jews and Christians took the lead in collecting and copying manuscripts from all over Europe after the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria. The burning of the library happened in stages. The worst part was really before Christianity was a thing. Julius Caesar was trying to kill an opponent, and he accidentally burned up more of the city than he was supposed to. And then there was another fire that burned up a lot of it. Alright. During the Dark Ages, Arabic medicine advanced considerably due to their access to these documents. In Europe, however, progress was comparatively slow. It was Christian thought that led to the formation of Western universities. We're going to come back to that. Founding of medical faculties was often due to Christian initiative. So too were attempts to raise standards of research and care. Surgery saw the most progress, and we could go on. Medical ethics, the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic ideal, if Hippocrates, a Greek, was expanded by doctors such as Thomas Brown, a godly physician who was one of the first to write on medical ethics and whole person care. Thomas Percival, zealous social reformer, as a physician of integrity, drew on the professional code of ethics in the 18th century. From that time, Christian thought has shaped much of the modern profession's ethical conduct, promoting personal integrity, truthfulness, and honesty. There we go. Many early GPs were religious men, and non-believers often unconsciously continued to follow the prevailing general principles of Christian ethics. 2 devastating world wars, followed by increasing secularization and humanistic thought, combined with rapidly advancing ability to perform new medical procedures, have brought about unprecedented, ethically uncertain situations. Bioengineering, genetics, and surgery urgently require new codes of ethics, and many of the current laws and suggestions by regulatory bodies have been influenced by the Christian attitude and outlook. So we could go on. Look, public health. We've got problems when the Industrial Revolution led to inner cities and intense social needs among the poor. It was the Quakers, Evangelicals, and Methodists who in particular applied themselves to vigorously meeting these needs. A nationwide movement of Christian missions to help the poor was founded. Huge sums of money was raised by voluntary subscriptions, and armies of volunteers went to slum areas to offer practical help. Attention was paid to the misfits of society, such as drunkards, criminals, and prostitutes, as well as homeless teenagers. Alright, we could keep going. There's so much information that we just have to stop. Alright, now that we'll move on to a different subject. What did Christianity do for the equality of the classes? Let's just take a look at the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known laws. Look what it says here. Alright, this is the Code of Hammurabi. We're kind of into it here. Law 209, 210. Look, if a man strike a freeborn woman so that she lose her unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels for her loss. If the woman dies, his daughter shall be put to death. If a woman of free class lose her child, 5 shekels. If a woman die, he pays half a mina. I mean, what's the deal here? This is clearly treating women like they're not as valuable as the man. I mean, if he kills her, if you kill someone else's daughter, then you got to give your daughter. It's not your life on the line. Do you see the difference there? Whereas, it's not an eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life thing. All right, this is this considers women as a second class. If you take a look at the Iliad. Basically like the Bible to ancient Greeks. In that story, Achilles' gay lover that he shared a bed with since he was 16, Patroclus, is killed by the Trojan hero Hector. And so Achilles, as payback, takes 7, if I remember right, 7 Trojan slave children and cuts their necks and kills them. And in the story, that's seen as maybe a bit excessive, but understandable considering how awesome Patroclus was. Okay, they changed it for the movies because today we wouldn't accept that in a story. We wouldn't accept Achilles as a hero. Why wouldn't we accept that? Because we've been Christianized. We've been Christianized by passages like this, right? Look at this passage from Psalm. Well, this is Matthew 5. But no, let's look at the other one here. Psalm 82. I just picked one. There are jillions of passages like this in the Old Testament. And God has taken his place in the divine council. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked, give justice to the weak and the orphans, the fatherless? Or, just the bad kids who don't have good parental guidance and they run around and do bad. That's what he means, the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy and deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Amazing. This, over and over again in the Old Testament, God sets himself up as the defender of the poor. And here we are in the New Testament. Jesus takes everyone that they think, the poor in spirit, those who mourn, and he says, they'll be blessed by God. Christ came to fulfill the law. Here it says that you shouldn't even be angry with someone. That's like murdering them in your heart. Here, he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In other words, even if someone truly is evil, you still don't consider yourself less than them. You love them. In Christianity, everyone's a sinner and deserves to go to hell. That's the core belief. So you see the difference between that and, the law code of Hammurabi or something like what's going on in Greek times. Those are just two examples. We could keep going. And we'll see some more stuff. But what about human sacrifice? Well, there's of course the Phoenicians who founded the colony that became the mighty empire that lasted for 800 years called Carthage. It was eventually defeated by the Romans. And the Romans said, yeah, the Carthaginians. And then, of course, in the Bible we hear about the Phoenicians, which are kind of the parent civilization. Yeah, it's Lebanon today. Yeah, they totally were into human sacrifice. And eventually the nation of Israel under King Ahab and Queen Jezebel got into child sacrifice. And they burnt their babies to the Moloch. Human sacrifice. Okay? Look at this article. It's a Big Think article, which typically isn't very friendly towards Christianity. And look what it's not loading. Here it goes. Researchers discover a new reason why ancient societies practice human sacrifice. And they've got this drawing of the Aztecs here. But human sacrifice today is part of urban legends or the serial murders of a few craven madmen. But dig deeper into history and you find it was a part of many societies and took place in most regions around the world. In other words, it was commonplace in the ancient world. Though condemned by the international community and wiped off the face of the earth as far as we know, the idea of human sacrifice still sends chills up our spine. Look at this. And this is a article trying to explain why it was so common, and what they're arguing is that there was political power used to eliminate people that you didn't were getting in your way or something like that, and they're just trying to figure out why it was so common. Amazing. Let's go back. Places that did it: the South Pacific, ancient Japan, early Southeast Asian societies, ancient Europe, certain Native American cultures in Mesoamerica, among the great civilizations of the ancient world. So he said all the minor places, and then he's going to say, and of course among the great civilizations of the ancient world: Babylon, Egypt, China, Greece, and even the precursor to the Romans. Even though the Romans, I think they didn't do it, but their Etruscans took part in ritualized killings. And, well, the Romans had their Colosseum battles, so, they had it too. But in ancient China and Egypt, for instance, slaves were often buried alive, along with the body of their sovereign, to serve him in the afterlife. And I couldn't find the reference for you, but apparently we found many such graves in ancient Babylon too. What happened? This article is about, boy, this is so weird to us today. What happened? Christianity happened. And in the Bible, you have this story of Abraham, and God calls him to sacrifice his son Isaac, and then at the last second God says, no, don't do that. We're never going to do that. And people like Christopher Hitchens get really upset and say, you know, I'm not going to respect a man who was willing to do that and say, oh, he had a lot of faith. What a terrible guy who was, even that he was willing to do that. You know, but what Christopher Hitchens is failing to realize is that it was common in the ancient world. It was considered a true devotion to the gods to do that. And what the story of Abraham and Isaac on, you know, Mount Carmel, not Mount, whatever the mountain was, Horeb, it takes that whole thing about child sacrifice, and in a very dramatic way, it says, never do that. And then, so the idea is, yes, that level of devotion to God is a good thing, but because you're devoted to God, that's why you don't do that. Because you're devoted to a true God, a good God, who would never ask you to do that. And then if you look at, you know, the famous story of Telemachus, when Rome finally ended the combat to the death for, you know, gladiatorial combat to the death for entertainment, it was a Christian monk named Telemachus comes to the Colosseum, and he doesn't know where he's at, but he felt like God led him there, and he sees it going on, and he goes down in the middle of the Colosseum. And you gotta understand, Rome had, you know, pretty well embraced Christianity by this point, but that practice was still going on. And he goes down there and says, in the name of Christ, forbear, stop this. And the crowd, you know, run him through, you know, because he's running to the middle of it, and the gladiators kill him, and his last words are, in the name of Christ, forbear. And what the historian tells us is that one by one, people got up and walked out of there that day, and that many other factors came to bear, but it was the death of Telemachus that crystallized the opposition, because there was a movement to stop it, but that really crystallized the opposition to get the gladiatorial combat ended. Okay, so yeah, human sacrifice. Alright, let's keep going. The equality of women. Hopefully, yeah. The equality of women. The uplifting of women. So, yeah, we've got law in the ancient world. We're coming back to, well, I mean, remember the Hammurabi code where, you know, a woman was clearly not equal to a man, because if he murders a woman, then he has to pay with another woman, you know, not his life. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? This little article here has, like, just tons of references to different ancient law codes. So the Codex Ashuna actually predates Hammurabi a little bit. And we've got some Hittite laws, which was an ancient civilization nearby. If someone kills a man or woman in the result of a quarrel, he shall and give 4 slaves, male or female. If someone kills a male or female slave as a result of a quarrel, he should give 2 slaves, male or female. If someone blinds a man or knocks out his tooth, he should give, look at this. Or how about this in the Iliad here? They've got a quotation from the Iliad, the first ever Greek text. People were gathered, dispute had arisen, 2 men were arguing about the blood money for a slain man. One was claiming to pay all, expounding the village. The other was refusing to take anything. Showing favor to the side, heralds people the sick. And so someone was killed, and in the middle, 2 talents of gold are paid. Look at that. Here's Exodus. But anyway, we won't get into, you know, anything about the biblical laws because we've got so many other videos on that. More about the role of women. We're just getting started. Here's Pandora. Image search on Pandora. The Greek concept of the origin of women is this woman Pandora. And she was basically the first woman. And so the story is, you know, here's a real brief version. Prometheus wanted the humans to become more intelligent, and Zeus, who had created the humans, did not want them to advance. And so Prometheus gives the humans fire as like their first technology, and so Zeus says, and he like secretly does it, he steals the fire, so Zeus is ticked off. And so what Zeus does is he responds with creating woman as a way, you've in other words, Zeus is like, the cat's out of the bag. I can't take fire away from the humans. They've got it now. They're going to advance in technology. What I need to do is introduce something in there that you can't remove. And so humanity had existed at that point as just all males. But then he introduces the first woman, Pandora, and Zeus calls her the beautiful evil. And the idea is that her beauty will literally take away man's intelligence and make him like an animal. And the Greeks had a strong, and the Greeks and Romans who followed them were strongly devoted to homosexuality. In fact, they didn't have a word for homosexual and heterosexual. It was just, they didn't have, that wasn't like a way you identified yourself. But the idea was that homosexuality was normal and practiced all the time. This is the way it worked in Sparta. Weddings were set up. Everyone was in the military, whether they liked it or not, or all the males were. Weddings were arranged by families. And the marriage ceremony was you had to sneak out at night under the cover of darkness without being seen, sneak into your bride's bedchamber, have sex with her, and sneak out without anyone seeing you, and go back to your squad of men that you stayed with all the time. Homosexuality was common in this place. It was considered that the thing in the Greek and Roman world was sensuality was evil. So being overcome with sexual desire was evil. But the idea was that homosexuality or sex with women that didn't overtake your mental faculties was okay. And so you see, it goes back to that Pandora myth that women were created and the beauty of women turns you into an animal and takes away your intelligence. And so there was a strong emphasis that you had to have sex that didn't do that. And in fact, the key in Rome and Greece was that when you had sex, you had to be like a man. And you had to be in authority and in control and not just overtaken by your desires. You had to maintain your wits about you and not become just an animal that's controlled by your sensual desires. And so the penetrative role in both Rome and Greece, the one who was the penetrator, even in the homosexual relationship, should have been the older, more dominant one who's the leader in the situation. So things were broken off into submissive roles and dominant roles. So it would be considered very bad for a woman to have a dominant position and a man to have a submissive position. Or if a man was supposed to be, if he's going to have homosexual sex, to be older. Although in Sparta, it was typically with men of the same age, because that was who your squad of soldiers was. So yeah, it was a big deal. You can look up that. Sexuality was clearly changed. Women were clearly second-class citizens in these societies, especially in Rome. And I mean, men had, so if you were a married man, it was considered an offense for you to go to a prostitute. But if you were to have concubines, then that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, which is kind of weird. You would have one wife who would bear you your like legit children, but concubinage, I mean, women would have concubine of so-and-so on their tombstone. Anyway, we've got to keep going. So if you're someone who speaks English today, then you're basically a mix of a Celtic person and a Germanic barbarian person. But the Celts were conquered by the Romans and basically Romanized. So most of that Celtic cultural identity was lost, but genetically you're largely Celtic, or if you're British or French or whatever. So in other words, England was really Britannia and a bunch of Celts that were conquered by the Romans and Romanized, and then the English came and they changed the language to English, and it's English anglicized. And then France was Gaelic Celts who were conquered by the Romans and completely Romanized, but then after Rome fell apart, the Franks, who were barbarians just like the English, came over and conquered. Anyway, look at marriage in the Celtic world. Celtic marriage was different from what we think of today. It was very rarely done out of love, usually out of political gain for the families, tribes involved. It was also not a religious event, but a contractual agreement. Celtic law is very complex, so what I'm going to here is merely skims the surface. Alright. Trial marriages that lasted a year and a day. Wow. They had degrees of marriage. First degree union takes place between partners of equal rank and property. Second degree union is in which a woman has less property and the man is supported by him. Third degree union is in which a man has less property than the woman and has agreed to pay to management of the woman's cattle and fields. It's like some kind of business deal. Fourth degree union is the marriage of the loved one in which no property rights has changed hands, though the children's rights are safeguarded. Fifth degree is mutual consent of the man and woman to share bodies but live under separate roofs. Sixth degree is when a defeated enemy's wife is abducted. This marriage is valid as long as the man can keep the woman with him. You see this a lot in Arthurian legends and traditional Welsh tales. Seventh degree union is called a soldier's marriage and is temporary and primarily one-night stand. Eighth degree occurs when a man seduces a woman through lying, deception, or taking advantage of her intoxication. Ninth degree union is forcible rape. And 10th degree union occurs when feeble-minded or insane people. The Celts were believers in polygamy, so second wives and concubines were common, especially before the Roman invasion of their native lands. Multiple husbands were less common, but not unheard of. There were even laws that stated a first wife could legally murder the second wife within the first 3 days of the marriage. She would still have to pay a fine, but other than that, she was within her rights. Their laws used the payment of fines to solve just about every problem, from divorce to murder. It's hard to tell how Roman law and then Christianity affected these practices, but I believe it's safe to say that polygamy and some of the more scandalous forms of marriage fell out of favor once Christianity became a major factor in Celtic life. We know that by the time these laws were written down by Irish monks, they were already amending pagan-era rules to suit their Christian audiences. Christianity changed things. Alright. The Germanic peoples. This is your English side, basically. Now, they had marriages that lasted for life, but they weren't exactly, you know, what we think of. And they did have polygamy. Alright. 7th century AD, Edict of Arthari of the Lombards, which would have been a Germanic barbarian tribe, right, which would have been 600s, stated that women were not allowed to live of their own free will and that they had to be subject to a man and if no one else, and they were to be under the power of a king. Or if no one else, they were to be under the power of a king. For Germanic women of later antiquity, marriage also obviously had its appeal given their reduced status otherwise. Although before these times there was sort of a fear of women because everyone believed that women had magic powers. But again, Christianity clearly changed the role of women. And you say, well, how does that work? Well, in Christianity, you have Ephesians 5, which clearly says that a woman is supposed to treat a husband like her ruler, like he's God. But then it goes on to say that a husband is supposed to treat her like Christ or God treated the church. And so in Christianity, although a woman does treat the husband like God, in Christianity you have a God who made himself the ultimate slave to humanity, the servant of humanity, and bore the punishment for them. And so this is a sign of mutual submission in a Christian view of women in marriage. Alright. Not only that, I mean, there's plenty of examples. Jesus basically took all of his important statements, or not all of them, but some of the most important things Jesus ever said when God became one of us and walked the earth, and the most important event of all of history, and he revealed them to women. Okay, now what about work ethics? You know about work ethics, like good day of hard work? It's a Christian idea. You didn't know that, did you? Yeah, so in the ancient Greek and Roman world, like, work was seen as a bad thing. But in Christianity, Adam was created in the garden and he was told to work, but then he was, how you say, the toil and the drudgery of work was seen as a bad thing and a result of man's sin. But work itself wasn't a bad thing. Whereas in the Greek ideas led to an increase in knowledge, but they by about 200 BC they kind of died out. And so the Christian view of work really kind of gave rise to science, because it saw working with your hands is not a bad thing, and people who work with their hands were not considered retards and fools and low class anymore. But whereas in the Greek society, people who were book learned and devoted to ideas were the high class. So it was recognized that work was necessary for the satisfaction of material needs, but philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle made it clear that the purpose for which the majority of men labored was in order that the minority, the elite, might engage in pure exercises of the mind, art, philosophy, and politics. Divisions of labor, and that kind of thing. And you could go more, they were very detailed about this. The mechanical arts were deplored because they required a person to use practical thinking, brutalizing the mind till it was unfit for thinking of truth. So this devotion to ideas led to a Greek explosion of technology and science, but ultimately it like stalled out. And it wasn't until Christianity came in the Middle Ages, and you brought back what the German philosopher Hegel calls the master-slave dialectic, where you have the guy over here with all of his papers and his ideas and his book learning, and then you have the guy over here who works with his hands. He gains an understanding of the intrinsic nature of concrete reality. And if those two guys are on the same team and communicating as equals, that's pivotal to science, because you have ideas and theoretical physics, and then you test your ideas. And when those two people become the same guy, that is an origin of science. But it's also an origin of just the Christian idea that work and a good honest day's work is a good thing. It was seen literally as a bad thing. Like if you were a person who worked, then we just have to put up with you because we need you so that the important people can live. It's literally how Plato saw it. And that his idea, of the philosopher kings is still a saying that people say today, that the world should be ruled by these philosopher kings. Not a Christian idea. Christians saw a good, honest day's work as a good thing, and that person had as much to teach the book-learned man as the book-learned man had to teach that person. Let's keep going. Okay, science. Yeah. Who created the scientific method? Francis Bacon created the scientific method. Alright? Yes, he was British, and yes, his name's Bacon. And the scientific method was this basic idea that his argument was very simple. Look at his quotes from him down there. He's concerned about knowledge. There are two books laid out before us to study, to prevent our falling into error. First, the volume of Scriptures, which reveal the will of God, then the volume of the creatures, which expresses power. He means studying science. So literally, his argument was, in his day, based on Genesis 1:27, the dominion mandate, that God created us to manage the world. Therefore, we can just make really good guesses about the world, try to prove them wrong. If we fail to prove them wrong, then, ta-da, we were right. And that's essentially science. You don't arrive at a definite, you can't know for sure, because maybe one day we'll do an experiment or get some more information and find out that our theory was wrong. But what he was arguing was that God meant for us to manage the world, so therefore we should be able to go with these best guesses. Alright. But it's not just Francis Bacon. The creation of science was a process. We've even got the technology of the medieval period. Here's a Wikipedia on it, and here's one that I really wanted us to not miss. There's so many different things, but the university. The idea of a bastion of knowledge. I mean, Christians didn't create schools, they didn't create places of learning, but the idea of an institution that has been created to literally, its goal is to increase the general population's rise in literacy and learning. That it wants to educate people, it wants to defend, guard, and spread knowledge, and that it exists for that purpose is a Christian idea. People had cared about knowledge for a long time, but they hadn't cared about the preservation and places to spread knowledge, and sort of, it's kind of like the hospital. Okay, so yeah, we have Christianity to thank for universities. Here we go. The scholastic monks. So if we go back to the origins of science, we go back a little further, these Christian monks, deeper in the Middle Ages, deeper in the Dark Ages, they were very devoted to they devoted their lives to the acquisition of mystic and spiritual knowledge. Their goal is said to be the accumulation of knowledge that can unlock the mysteries of the universe for the benefit of all. They created the idea of scientific law, or what they called natural law. And it was really born out of this idea of monotheism. So if you go back to the ancient, barbarians or the Romans or the Greeks, they believed in multiple gods who would have to keep things secret from one another. Loki would have a ring with like some magic powers, and then Odin would have to teach. Odin taught them magic words, right? Or Woden to write on their axes with magic letters so that they would hit the target. And the gods were always interfering in the world and interfering with one another. But once you have one God, then you're able to say, okay, let's take a step back. God doesn't have to ever interfere because He's an ultimate God. So therefore, He can create the world in such a way that He will never have to interfere. And everything can go out and happen just like He planned for it to happen because He's the ultimate planner. And so they began to look for His plan, sort of His guiding rules to how He set everything up so that everything will work out the way He wants. And they called this secondary causation. That He set up these rules and He knew what would be the result of the laws of the universe that He made. And so this is where the idea of natural law came from. The scholastic monks cared so much about the pursuit of this knowledge because it was a holy thing for them, that there is one God who created the world, and that the finding of scientific laws was like reading God's plan book for how He made the universe. And you could predict what would happen just like God could predict what would happen if you had a better knowledge of what those laws were. And we still look for those laws today. We still talk about laws of science. But they took a vow of silence and secrecy regarding their knowledge, speaking only when the leaders of the monastery had deemed it time to speak. Because, look at it, it is said that a monk would suffer 1,000 torments and die before sharing the slightest bit of information to someone he deems unworthy or not ready. Amazing. Amazing. The scholastics. So you get the idea. This is clearly how, this is the cultural world that gave birth to science. There is an explanation for why Europe was the place that created the scientific and industrial revolution that changed the rest of the world. From everything from medical to travel to energy, to factories, to the Industrial Revolution, to whatever it is, Christianity created a world that created science, that allowed science to be born. And so in that society, you have a total change and room for a total change. Okay. Let's keep going. I think we're down to what happened to Rome. Yeah, so what happened to Rome? Well, one of the reasons why Rome fell apart, there were a lot of reasons. Barbarians invaded, some plagues. But Rome had defeated barbarians for a long time. They'd been dealing with stuff for a long time. But one of the things that was new to the situation wasn't so much the barbarians to the north, but Christianity changed the nation. And Rome for a long time had believed that everyone should be Roman. And that really fueled the mental energy and gave them the impetus to make everyone Roman. But when Christianity came along, it really defeated this idea that we should go around and convert everyone in every way, which is fascinating because Christianity is all about converting people, but Rome converted people by the sword, and Christianity wanted to win people over. Look. Alright. I don't know why that guy started singing to me. But anyway. Here we go. Romanization. Latinization. So, what the Romans did was they would conquer a place and then they would make them into Romans. So, your British ancestors, by the time that Rome was finally receding and falling apart, they spoke Latin. They wore togas. They had Roman baths, Roman architecture. Native elites were, the ruling classes of whatever place they conquered were encouraged to increase social standing through association with the powerful conqueror, the Romans, be it in dress, language, housing, and food consumption. This provided the native elites with associated power. The establishment of a civil administration system is quickly imposed to solidify the permanence of Roman rule. You get the idea. They're going to change your architecture. They're going to change your, the Romans eventually took the Alps and just used that to pump water all over the empire. And there's a reason why there's nations today, they call them Latin languages, which would generally be France, Italy, and Spain. They're just versions of Latin, either the language, Spanish, French, and Italian. Okay, so yeah, gradual adoption of the Roman language, adoption of Roman names, disseminations of Roman institutions like public baths, emperor cult, gladiator fights. Oh yeah, in Rome, religion was connected to, in other words, there was an official religion. Although you were allowed to worship any gods, you had to include that as part of your worship of the Roman imperial court. And there wasn't a distinction between separation of church and state. In the ancient world, we'll talk about that in a minute, the god and the high priest and the religion and the government were the same thing. So the authority to rule the people was seen as handed down from the gods, and that was just how things were done. Religion was at the center of every early Babylonian city. Okay, and most of the time what they would do when they came to someone who had different gods is they would say, you're just worshiping the same gods and they're under a different name. And it's really, all of the gods are actually similar, and we're really all one big happy religion, so give money to the official Roman church. Alright, so, well, they wouldn't have called them churches. Now, so there's that. Basically, Christianity changed the world by getting rid of Rome. Probably. They rationalized religion. There was a big debate happening between religion and basically philosophy or knowledge and the learned. And so there were two schools of skepticism that formed after Plato. So there's the Pyrrhic school, and then there's the Platonic academic school of skepticism towards religion. Basically, people started doubting religion heavily once philosophy and rational learning became something that people sought after. Then religion and the ancient myths there was this conflict that went on for centuries in the Greek and Roman world between religious beliefs like the myths of Homer and Zeus and the Iliad, and on the other hand you had the questions of how do we know anything to be true? What can we really know? And the philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and other guys too. So this debate raged on, and what Christianity did is they actually, one of the main things they did is they brought in a religious idea that was logical and made rational sense. So, one example of how Socrates famously doubted religion was he said, do the gods command us to do good things because it's good, or do they, or is it good because they command it? And he said, well, people would say, well, there's no way that it's good because they command it, because then they can make anything they want to good with the roll of a dice, so therefore they command it because it's good. And then Socrates will say, well, then we should just be good for reasons other than because they say so. And that's why, so we don't really worship and follow the gods when we do the right thing. We just do the right thing because it's the right thing. And that's just an example of this debate that raged on. It was really Christianity that brought in this idea of the perfect ultimate God that could become the standard of goodness. And it really comes to a golden sort of theological climax, especially when Augustine comes along in the 400s and really connects. Christianity brought in a philosophical idea where religion made sense. And it was a new thing in this debate that had raged for centuries. These are just like footnotes to history that we're going through here. There's, of course, martyrdom. How could I leave out martyrdom? So here's the martyrdom of Stephen, or artist depiction of the martyrdom of Stephen. The ideal of martyrdom is very much a Christian idea. The word martus is the Greek word that means witness, and so the Christians died for just their testimony about that they knew Christ. And Stephen, of course, is the first Christian martyr. But the question is, and it was an obsession in the early church. In fact, it was such a big deal that the Christian churches came up and they believed that martyrdom itself was a spiritual gift that had to be given to you by God, and you couldn't just go get martyred for your belief in Jesus just because you wanted to. Jesus had to spiritually enable you to be a true martyr and truly go to the flames or whatever with the love of Christ on your lips. But here's the thing. How does martyrdom make sense when there's a God who... It only makes sense when there's a God who's in control. In other words, the Christians were obsessed. They saw the finger of God moving throughout all of history and Christ as essential figure. Maybe a way to kind of give this example, something make it a little understandable, is let's just take a look at Return of the Jedi. So here in this part of the movie, Luke Skywalker really takes a Christian twist, because he's cut off Darth Vader's hand, and the Emperor says, strike him down and you will finally complete your path to the dark side and become more powerful, yada yada yada. And Luke realizes at that moment that, basically, if he does what, he's been taught by Yoda and Obi-Wan to kill the bad guys, then fear of what might happen, because, in other words, Vader has just figured out that Leia is his sister, right, through the knowledge of the Force, right? And so Luke freaks out and goes into a rage. He's afraid of what might happen. He wants to protect his sister. And so fear of what might happen makes Luke go into a rage to kill his father. In other words, this is utilitarianism. This is the idea that we've got to prevent the bad from happening. And so when Luke realizes this, he throws his lightsaber down and he really does what Yoda didn't want him to do, what no one wanted him to do. They wanted him to kill the bad guys. And the point is that this good desire to stop bad things from happening was what ultimately led Vader to the dark side in the first place, because he was afraid that his wife was going to die the way his mama had died, and he wanted more power to stop bad things from happening. And so what that does is it makes you cross moral boundaries because of fear of what might happen and do things that you shouldn't do. And when Luke realizes this, he throws his lightsaber down, and the movie takes a Christian twist. The only way that makes sense is if there's a God who's in control and is looking out for us. Then we don't have to cross moral boundaries to make the right thing happen. And so this concept of martyrdom is just a powerful idea that Christianity introduced to the world. And that's kind of the point I was making there. Another powerful idea would just be Jesus Christ as the Savior. You know, Jesus Christ, you had basically Savior mythologies in the ancient world where here's a king, he's bad, and this other good king comes and takes over, and now the good king's here. And then the Greeks brought in a new idea called the hero, which was like a regular guy, or maybe a half divine guy, but he wasn't the ruler. He would just come in and save everyone and then kind of ride out of town like a western. But it was the idea of the hero. He was just here to save the day. He wasn't here to rule anyone. And, you know, given some of the things that had happened in the Bronze Age where rulers had become really, oppressive, and civilizations had fallen apart because of that, it made sense. But Christianity brought in the idea of a Savior who saves us from our own evil inside ourselves. It's a radical idea. I mean, your barbarian ancestors believed in Thor and Ragnarok, and that all of humanity was created, and if you died in combat, that meant you qualified for Odin's military recruitment program, and if you died in any other way, you went down to a place they called Hell. But if you qualified, you went to Valhalla, and you would fight until the end of time. You would train to fight in the ultimate war, and we would just barely win the ultimate war, and only 2 people would live, but good would win just barely. So that was what they believed, Ragnarok, right? But Christianity turned it around, and this is what your ancestors, they wore little hammers on their necks there in Germany to represent, I'm not a Christian, I'm staying true to the old ways, because the Christians were wearing these little crosses. So they would wear little Thor hammers. But Christianity brought in this powerful idea that the evil is inside us, and that Jesus has come, the ultimate God, and instead of helping us kill the bad guys, He will be killed, because we're the bad guys. Mind-blowing story. And that's a way that Christianity changed the world. You can't tell a story anymore without thinking about that story. That powerful, powerful story. And it's so powerful. Christianity is such a powerful story that once cultures embrace Christianity, if they turn their back on it, they don't go to another religion. They go to atheism. It's like there's no religion left after Christianity. It's like you're in the shadow of a giant cross and you're never going to get out of it. Let's keep going. This is probably the one that's going to offend people the most. Christianity created democracy and our concepts of individual liberty and freedom. Now, you may say that the Greeks created democracy, but it's not entirely accurate. The idea that voting is a human right is Christian, because Christianity gave birth to the idea of human rights. Look at something, or even take something like the Bill of Rights. Look at this little thing of the little cartoonsy of the Bill of Rights. Think about the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, petition. Think about the right to bear arms. Isn't that dangerous? Isn't it dangerous when a soldier, a random guy can go into Orlando and a gay bar and kill everyone? Isn't it dangerous to make it so difficult to arrest someone and lock them up? I mean, you can't search their house without a warrant, and then you have to have this trial, and there has to be a jury for, like, difficult trials. And then there's all kinds of, you can't be, if they find out later that you really did do it, but you were found innocent, there's no double jeopardy, that's it. And then the punishment has to be fair. You can't have extreme punishments to keep people in line. I mean, that's dangerous. A lot of bad people get away. What about freedom of religion? In France, they just banned Scientology because they say it's stupid and dangerous. I mean, you pay $10,000 to these people, and it supposedly cures all your emotional and mental problems. I mean, that's obviously a scam. So in France, they just ban it. That country has 3% church attendance. They're mostly atheists. They have atheist congressmen who are like, and the atheist congressman said, the reason we have a problem with Scientology trying to get into our country is because in America, y'all let it get big, because in America, under the First Amendment, anything goes. So this idea of individual human rights is dangerous. To give all these freedoms to the people is dangerous. To give voting rights as a human right is dangerous. That's how you wind up with people like Donald Trump running against Hillary Clinton, right? It's dangerous. But you don't have to take away people's basic human rights if you believe there's a God who's looking out for us. In other words, we all get that it's good that people should have those rights, like to vote and believe what you want to and say what you want to and protect yourself and not have police search your house unless they have good reason to, etc., etc. But here's the thing. We are willing to take away people's rights if we're afraid of what might happen. It's just like the martyrdom thing. It's this whole idea in Christianity that there's a God who's looking out for us, and so therefore we don't have to do bad things to make sure that worse things don't happen, because there's a God who's looking out for us. And so, think about Stephen, the martyr. I mean, couldn't Stephen have kept his mouth shut that day? Why didn't Stephen just not talk about Jesus for one day? He can talk about Jesus for the next 70 years if he just shuts up that day. I know he's supposed to tell people about Jesus, but in the bigger picture, maybe doing the bad thing here, the good would have outweighed the bad in the long run. Or maybe not. Maybe, just maybe. Stephen saw the finger of God moving through history. He saw Jesus sitting at the right hand of God and was overjoyed at what happened. This blew people's mind in the ancient world. And it is a core idea that leads to the ideals of basic individual rights that you don't get when there's no God. You don't get in an atheistic society. You don't get freedom of speech and religion and press without a belief that there's a God out there looking out for us. Because, in France, where they banned the Church of Scientology and they're largely atheistic. Or let's keep going. I mean, if you want to look at how kind of more of how this happened. One of the biggest guys who brought in separation of church and state is, of course, John Wycliffe. There's a great movie on Netflix. John Wycliffe. It's called Wycliffe or something. You look at this article. One could say that all of Western civilization turned a corner with John Wycliffe, and he argued that the church should not be able to influence or tell people, what to do. He argued for the separation of church and state. He also, if you're reading in Bible in English, you can largely thank him for that. And the Catholic Church at the time was very corrupt. And his ideas were really the precursor to the Protestant Reformation. He lived, when did he live? 1330 to 1384. So he lived to be 54. And he died, and they were going to execute him for his beliefs and his writings and publishing his Bibles. But he already had died of a disease, and they had buried him. So what the Catholic Church did is they dug up his bones and burned them just to make him more dead, because they didn't like him. But this ideal of separation of church and state, that it's key in This idea that people should be able to believe what they want to, and the church shouldn't be able to just tell people what to believe. And it led to the Protestant Reformation, and this notion that, people should have the freedom to believe what they want to, and that kind of leads directly into freedom of religion. You see, we could keep going. This notion of, where does the notion of, most people trace the notion of human rights. Look at the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Whoever you are, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Not that all American citizens, but that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Magna Carta. People credit that as one of the first documents that really led to the notion of just human rights. And human rights is really what led to our modern concept of democracy itself. Because we believe that voting is a basic human right, whereas the Greeks had democracy because they saw it as there's a bunch of people and we're all going to decide how to do things. But it was the men and the wealthy landowning men of the city that just kind of just got together on how they ran things, whereas in the Western European world, the Magna Carta started something that blossomed and grew, whereas in Athens, democracy fell apart after a short time, and the city basically, they saw the bad side of democracy because everyone started disagreeing and there were riots and there were problems and the city wasn't unified. But in the Christian world, the idea of basic human rights, that we're not going to have total democracy where everyone runs everything, but there are certain rights that every person has. And look, there were just things, basic concepts in there, like the Magna Carta had a principle that said justice too long delayed is justice denied. And this leads to, after World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, things like the French Revolution, and these ideas, they came out of the cultural world that Christianity created. So, all of that said, if anyone has actually watched this video, you're probably saying to me, Ben, what about all that stuff I heard about how Christianity ruined the world, and how Christianity is the main thing wrong with the world, and how it was all the secularism and the getting rid of religion that really fixed the world? Hopefully, you're smart enough to catch on by this point that maybe all of that's not true, especially when it comes to individual human rights, because at the end of the day, they are dangerous and they don't make that much sense without God in the picture. Now, there's so much more that could be said about this, and I'm simply not going to say it because we've made the video and we're not going to make any more video today. This is the video as is. I hope this video made some sense. Thank you for your time.